Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another edition or editions, depending on how you look at things, of Cambridge Inside Out. My name is Robert Winters, and today is June 3rd, 2025. Got a few things. I don't have to do as much catch up since we actually did a program 2 weeks ago. So I can kind of be a little bit more current here. But there are a few things I do want to touch on. First thing I think I'd like to touch on here is just to mention that, and I'll say more about this in a moment here, but the um, the municipal elections are approaching. And again, I don't want to go into this in great length like I did last time, but what I did is I kind of weeded out some of the candidates who I think are not going to be running and added, some who may or are definitely running. So my current count is approximately 20 candidates seeking city council seats this year. 20 for 9 seats. And on the school committee, at least by my account, since Rachel Weinstein dropped out, there may be 8 candidates for 6 seats. But again, we'll see what happens, as time passes and, you know, and, things change potentially. I'm not sure what, other than the ones that I excised out of here, who I may have not have mentioned from last time. Certainly the newer ones are Ned Mallinson, who was a affiliate of A Better Cambridge. Somebody named Stanislav Rifkin, again, has also filed paperwork with the Office of Campaign and Political Finance, and who is, I believe, associated with a new group called CHOW, Cambridge Housing Affordability Alliance. I believe he's a Harvard affiliate, as are most of them. There's another fellow named Zion Sharon, who I have not met, who filed paperwork. And by the way, I believe all of these are actually opened up campaign accounts. So that's probably the surest sign that they're actually going forward with their candidacy. And I think everybody else, including me, are just people who may or may not be there, but who've actually been in the race before. So again, I think I'll sort of leave it at that for there. Um, the the time is approaching for um, you know candidates to emerge and to do the appropriate filing of paperwork. Of course, technically nobody's really a candidate until they pull nomination papers at the Election Commission. And the first day that you can do that will be July 1st, which is actually, I'm not sure what day of the week that is. Actually, I can tell you exactly what day of the week that is. That's a Tuesday, July 1st. And you have to gather a minimum of 50 valid signatures of registered Cambridge voters and a maximum of 100, because they don't want people just sort of sopping up all the available voters out there to prevent others from doing so. And the signatures would be due July 1st by 5 p.m., July 31st at 5 p.m. at the Election Commission offices, the Election Commission, which has been around the corner from me at 51 Inman for a good many years now. It used to be on Green Street above the old police station. But they are actually moving over to 689 Mass Ave, the old Citizens Bank building, where the city has taken over that building now. And I think they're in the process of moving either now or in the next few days. And I think by June 10th or 11th, they should be moved into the new building. So I'll have to walk a little farther to get my updates on who's pulled nomination papers, because I'll try and do that. Again, if I end up being a candidate, there is this awkwardness about being both a reporter and a candidate. But hey, what the hell, right? If Ned Sennett could do it back in the 30s, so could I. So if that's a cryptic reference, just give me a call and I'll explain it. So there are a few other things I think I would mention. Actually, let me sort of go back to my little cheater here to assist. Um, the Here we go. Um, so um, One of the things that I think maybe it was a Harvard, could be wrong on this. It could be a Harvard Crimson article, was sort of trying to sort of lay the land of who the organizations are in Cambridge. And as I was sort of getting ready to do the programs today, I found myself just thinking through some of this, because I think if you're a Harvard Crimson reporter, actually, let me step away for just to say this here. If you're a Harvard Crimson reporter, there's a pretty good chance you don't have a lot of institutional memory. In fact, you might only have 6 months of institutional memory, or unless you grew up here in Cambridge. But even then, if you're of that particular age, you don't have a whole lot of historical memory about the various organizations and political affiliations and the what I sometimes will call the political dichotomies or trichotomies of Cambridge. Um, so I figured, well, maybe I ought to just do a little bit of a brain dump and just put some of it out there just to sort of say, what are the various affiliations and such. So I wrote a little bit today, wasn't planning to publish or anything, but ended up doing that anyway. So I'm just going to go over here and hope you don't mind if I just sort of read and comment as I go here. So, people nowadays think of everything in terms of these various slate organizers like the Cambridge Citizens Coalition or the Better Cambridge or Cambridge Bike Safety or what have you. But going back quite honestly, all the way even to the 1930s, but technically the Cambridge Civic Association didn't technically come into existence until 1945. But from that point on, all the way until really the end of rent control, the political dichotomy of Cambridge was really the CCA, or Cambridge Civic Association, versus the independents. I guess by some definition, the independent was just meant not CCA, and there was kind of a division. Independents tended to be not so much respect CCA and vice versa. Though there were many years where actually they got along just fine. They were just kind of coming from different points of view. In some respects, it was a town versus gown matter, right? If you were an independent, chances are you were born and raised in Cambridge. And we typically thought of the CCA as affiliated with sort of the upper crust and the college educated or advanced degree crowd. But it wasn't always as simple as that. Let me be really clear about that. But over time, certainly by the time I was getting around here, I got here in 1978, most people at that point associated Cambridge Civic Association with those who favored rent control, and the independents were typically those who were opposing rent control. And that was sort of the dichotomy that I grew up in, where rent control was sort of the guiding light for all of politics in Cambridge. And then as long as you were on the right side or the wrong side of that, then you could have nuance and be focused on other issues and whatever. But it was really everything was dominated by the one issue. I suppose these days we're dominated by things like, are you gung-ho super densification pro-development or versus historic preservation? Are you gung-ho for bike lanes or are skeptical about bike lanes? And there are other dividing lines these days, but back in those days, it was, sort of even after rent control ended in 1994, the 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 those who had been affiliated with CCA still sort of persisted for at least a decade, because if you voted CCA your whole life, you typically continue to do that even after the CCA wasn't there anymore. And the independents, I always understood them as ones who were a bit more on the pro-development side, but primarily because by growing the tax base, you could actually control residential taxes, and that tended to be, a high priority for the people who we thought of as independents. We went through a period of some years where it was sort of every man, every woman for himself, where the affiliations were kind of, they just weren't there. But I think maybe about 10, 12 years ago, the whole idea about candidate slates and such started to reemerge. And again, this is a very imperfect account. It was sort of thrown together just today when I was just feeling like it. But somewhere around, I think 2013-ish, thereabouts, I think largely in response to a report, it was sort of spurred on by then Mayor Ken Reeves, that led to a report about promoting housing development, middle-income housing development. I don't know how they were going to engineer that exactly, in and around Central Square. And then there were people who lived on Essex Street and thereabout who were very concerned about the overdevelopment that was going to happen on their little street and what have you. And out of that, though they will deny this forever, I'm sure, but the Cambridge Residents Alliance came into existence. I think it began as Essex Street Neighbors or something. But in a rather kind of curious way, they were opposed to residential development or any kind of development for that matter in around Central Square, which caused a lot of people, a number of people, I was actually one of them, to kind of organize to basically be in support of what we, I guess, Governor Deval Patrick used to emphasize as transit-oriented development. And, obviously Central Square is a transit node. So, so a group of people started meeting about that, and I was with them, and they eventually took the name A Better Cambridge, and they were pretty much pro housing development at the time. Now, what happened, and I'm gonna sort of switch back here, back and forth a little bit. But what happened was there were people affiliated with the ABC group, or as it was then. I was there when they named it, actually. Um, and but there were people affiliated with them who were also professionally worked in the nonprofit housing sector. So slowly but surely, actually not so slowly, ABC started to shift and become promoters of subsidized housing, and they embraced the what was then emerging as the affordable housing overlay as sort of one of their strategies. Actually, initially they were more just general density, but then it became subsidized housing, I think, more strategically than anything else. And so they became known as, the AHO crowd, and they sold themselves as saying, vote for us if you're pro-housing. Anybody who's opposed to us has to be anti-housing, which was complete nonsense, but that was a good selling point, I think, politically, and that's how that went. So I'm going to just sort of skip back and forth here a little bit and speak to this some more. So, after the sort of the big flash of the AHO and whatever, eventually the A Better Cambridge group came to be more associated. They pushed through something called the was called the Missing Middle petition, which didn't really go anywhere. And in more recent years, they've basically been affiliated with just basically more, grow, more and more density, no matter where, no matter how, which is rankles a lot of people, myself included. I'm not of the opinion that you should just have unlimited amount of subsidized housing in this or any other city for that matter. And I do think that there is sort of a sweet spot in terms of how much development is a good amount, and beyond which maybe it isn't so good in terms of matters of livability and decent neighborhoods and traffic congestion and what have you. But anyway, that was it. Now, I think it is perhaps fair to say, just as A Better Cambridge, which I now call A Bigger Cambridge, uh, came about as a response to the original formation of the Residents Alliance. After ABC was around for a while, then the build crowd led to a kind of a counter movement, which um, led to the creation of a group called itself the Cambridge Citizens Coalition, which I think in terms of where they're coming from in the city, whatever, probably a little more CCA-like, a little more West Cambridge than not, but certainly not exclusively. And their themes were more like limited growth, not anti-growth, mind you, but more limited growth, pro-planning, more limited growth, and especially in established neighborhoods. In other words, don't overwhelm a good functioning neighborhood by just sticking gigantic buildings right in the middle of it all, over the objections of neighbors. But of course, the ABC people will write them all off as neighborhood defenders, as they like to call them. You're just, well, anyway, there's a lot of side aspects of this. But over time, there were other entities emerged as well. I think because of the Bernie Sanders election attempts, what grew out of it was something called Our Revolution. There was actually a group, I don't know if it's still around, called Sunrise, but I think it was called Sunrise Boston. It tended to have very young participants associated with them, but they were very much on the left end of the spectrum. And then certainly the emergence of the Democratic Socialists of America, or DSA group locally, which is, let's be clear, they are really the most hateful, nastiest people I think the city has ever seen. Um, but they largely draw from a lot of college aged and recent graduates. During some of the Middle Eastern conflicts of recent times, sort of you can pretty much guarantee that the pro-Hamas, anti-Israel crowd largely aligns with the DSA, and they don't seem to try and disguise that at all. There's another group that's sort of a national extent called the Party for Socialism and Liberation, which sort of is inserted into these, into the sort of the body politic. They grew out of a group called the Answer Coalition, which I believe I first encountered them when they were opposing the Iraq invasion, the United States going into Iraq back 22 years ago or so. Um, Anyway, I'm not so sure any of these groups are particularly large in extent or reach or whatever, though maybe the DSA as sort of a gathering point for aging and young Marxists is sort of, maybe they're kind of a real thing. Hard to say. Um, and then let's also be really clear that in addition to this sort of the typical, political groups, there's, just as ABC is a sort of a single issue group, there's the Cambridge Bike Safety Group, is also very much a big player in the municipal political world. They always seem to have a lot of money to burn, and they have the advantage of having only one issue to focus on, which is build bike lanes, separated bike lanes. Whether they're whether they're good or sensible doesn't seem to matter to them. They're just going to have them because it really is all about raw political power. And they've been pretty effective in exercising that rather raw political power. Anyway, the reason why I sort of writing this little bit earlier today, actually got to thinking about it yesterday, I believe, was as, I was kind of reminded, I'm going to just step out for a moment here. I was sort of reminded, largely because I went to a funeral of a friend, and there were a lot of people who were like, I think it was old time independence. And I was thinking to myself, that, that old political dichotomy that, really is a quarter century old, gone now, really, of the Cambridge Civic Association, CCA, versus the independents. Um, in a kind of an interesting twist, nowadays, when I speak to people who think of themselves more like townie people born and raised here, um, their orientation is actually pretty similar to that of the people with the Cambridge Citizens Coalition, which is kind of, the offspring of the old CCA in many respects. So it's interesting. The two opposite poles of the body politic of Cambridge from 20 some odd years ago are actually now on the same side, basically saying, hey, don't overrun my city. Hold on. We want to live here. Stop beating us up and, putting in 12-story buildings everywhere and choking off the roads and whatever. So now it's sort of like the two poles are now on one pole. And I don't know what to say on the other side. I guess it's the ABC crowd is sort of on the other side, at least in terms of the development issue. One side, the CCC and the townies basically saying, hold on. And the ABC people largely not listening to any of that and just saying, well, we don't care. We want to build the future for people who don't even live here, and that they're sort of the other side, at least in terms of the really identifiable ones. But certainly want to emphasize here that it's never going to be quite that simple. The Cambridge the Cambridge Bike Safety Group, with their rather single issue focus, probably can put some into either camp, quite honestly. And then, well, as always, the Marxists are the Marxists, the Democratic Socialists of America, Our Revolution, or some of these other kind of even more radical groups. They're sort of their own separate thing. It is interesting that the Cambridge Residents Alliance, when they first sprung into existence, were born out of opposing residential development, but then very often in much more recent years, they're very much gung ho for building more, but usually in the subsidized housing category. Um, but because you can't build housing without capitalism, let's unless you honestly believe everything is going to be government funded social housing, which is just nonsense. um, the DSA crowd, the Our Revolution crowd, are fundamentally opposite in that respect to the ABC crowd. We're fundamentally pretty capitalist. If you want to, we need developers to build more big buildings. Having a problem getting those words out there. Um, so it's very hard to get a kind of convenient marriage between the wackadoodle Marxists and the people who are the developers. It's not really an easy marriage. you know. Anyway, I don't know how this is all going to shake out in terms of municipal elections in this year. I mean, we've been seeing certain patterns that have been persistent for the last several election cycles. Um, we'll see whether all this Middle East politics, which has really nothing to do with Cambridge, whether that somehow still ends up defining political affiliations so that we're, electing some pretty radical people just based on whatever. Okay. Anyway, I I just thought I'd say that I'm going to just take one little quick look here just to see if there's anything I left out of my little screen here today. But Oh yeah, just say that, just in very, very recent times, there have been a few other entities. People make up these acronyms all the time, like the one's called the Cambridge Housing Justice Coalition, which is kind of a, hodgepodge mix of some of the wackiest of the wacky. Not that anybody's opposed to housing justice, mind you, but really some of the wackiest of all. And then there's another group that's, I think, more Harvard affiliated. Certainly, everybody who's identified with this Cambridge Housing Affordability Organizers, or CHOW, they all seem to live in Harvard housing or work for Harvard, and they have at least one candidate. I think maybe Mr. Rivkin, who is associated with their group. So it wouldn't be the first time a political entity emerged conveniently to promote a candidate. We'll see if that's really what's up. I mean, I don't want to be too hard on this, but wasn't quite sure what the Fresh Pond Residence Alliance was about, other than the fact that it helped put Jan Devereaux into city council for a couple of terms. So anyway, we'll see where 2025 leads. I'm sure now, since we're less than a month to people pulling nomination papers, people and organizations will be trying to, quote, define the issues, uh, almost always to their own convenience. I've often like to say, if you're just an average person in Cambridge or most anywhere else, the issues for you are things like, where am I going to go for my groceries? Can I park my car? That's like who knew that was going to be a big deal, except for the wackies are trying to remove all the parking on Broadway right now. Um, it tends to be ordinary things. If you've got kids, you're more concerned about your kids in schools and whatever, and not so. I think maybe that ought to be a bigger issue, quite honestly. The sort of somewhat dysfunctional nature of Cambridge schools. The more money you pour onto the fire, the the dimmer the fire gets, it seems sometimes. By the way, I believe the school committee is in the midst of a superintendent search, so I personally think that the current interim or acting superintendent, I believe his name is David Murphy, is actually very good. Hope they keep him. But Cambridge loves to do intergalactic searches in order to find the mythical person that doesn't really exist. But probably who checks the appropriate boxes, as they say. So anyway, so those are a few things I thought worth mentioning. Oh yeah, I should say, just in terms of the various groups that are been sort of active and doing things, and maybe though others will emerge. I like to think that, wouldn't it be great if there was sort of Cambridge Reasonable People organization was formed for people like me who don't comfortably fit into any of those categories. But hope springs eternal. Um, I think there was one other thing I was going to say about that. Oh yeah, and on the bike group, every group leads to a sort of a counter group in a way. And I guess it's just the nature of dichotomies. They can't just be one-sided, right? So just as there was a Cambridge bike safety group, there was a group that was formed called Cambridge Streets for All that was raising questions about the propriety of bike lanes everywhere or separated bike lanes everywhere, and some of the effect it had on local businesses, and certainly the um, rather difficult challenges to finding local parking, especially for those of us who don't have driveways. Thank you very much. So anyway, so I'll just sort of leave it at that here. One other thing that came up just the other day, and it's something I would like to speak on a little bit more. I think we spoke about it a couple of weeks ago on this program. Um, was this issue about city boards and commissions? Now, I think it was at the May 19th meeting that there was a kind of a controversy over the fact that there's a kind of a semi-vacancy right now with the Cambridge Peace Commission and the Police Review Advisory Board, which have shared a direct executive director, but there's some personal matters and personnel matters affiliated with that. So some of the city councilors are pretty much going where they shouldn't be going in terms of delving into personnel matters. Um, but at least the issue did come up about, well, maybe we should be revising those particular boards, which got me to thinking, well, maybe we should really be looking at all of them. And I've certainly had some conversations with the mayor and some other people about doing just that. And I think maybe what I'll just sort of mention here. So there was a city council order who wanted to kind of go where they shouldn't go on May 19th. Yeah, it was the 19th. And then it came up on with the charter right at the meeting yesterday at City Council, and the mayor introduced a substitute order. And I'm just going to just sort of jump over to that right now, just to mention it here, because it's really very much in alignment with what I was saying, which is, I'll just sort of say it here. Whereas the city council recognized the importance of ensuring that all city boards and commissions operate effectively and transparently to serve the needs of the community. Whereas a deeper familiarity by city councilors with the purpose, structure, and activities of these boards and commissions will foster improved communication and collaboration, supporting more efficient and effective city operations. And whereas currently city councilors may have limited opportunities to engage directly with the various boards and commissions to gain firsthand insight into their work, now therefore be it ordered that the Government Operations Rules Committee is hereby requested to conduct a thorough review of the roles, operations, and effectiveness of all city boards and commissions, and be it further ordered that following this review, the Government Operations Committee is requested to hold hearings at which city councils will have an opportunity to meet with each board and commission to better understand their contributions to the city. And be it further ordered, this shall be report back to the city council um, pretty soon, as we say. All right. Now I'm going to take a little momentary break shortly here, but it's a topic I do want to sort of speak to a little bit more. So let me just take my little artificial break here right now, and I'll be back in 1 second on Cambridge Inside Out.